As 1622 started, Osman was hell-bent on reforming the empire. But as we have explained in the previous episode, in Constantinople, he was surrounded by the Janissaries and religious men. And it was clear that he could not do a thing in the capital. Thus, he needed to get away from Constantinople and Europe in general. But he needed a reason to get out of the capital. A sultan could not leave the capital without a proper reason. And at a time of peace, he had no legitimate reason to leave the city. At first, he attempted to lead an army to Lebanon to suppress a minor rebellion there. But the bureaucrats and the Janissaries talked him out of it. For no sultan in the Ottoman history had led an army against the rebels. Following this attempt's failure, it did not take long for Osman to come up with another reason. He announced that he was going to Hajj. In Islam, every Muslim man and woman must visit Mecca if he or she is able to. Osman argued that a sultan was more than able to undertake the voyage. Thus, he had to go on the pilgrimage. However, at this point, Osman was fooling no one. According to a story, Osman talked about his plans with his wife, Akile Sultan. He told her all about his plans of going to Anatolia, gathering an army there, and abolishing the Janissaries afterwards. Akile Sultan did not seem to like Osman very much to begin with. She had not even joined Osman's harem in his palace and stayed at her father's house after their marriage. Being the daughter of Sheikhul Islam Esad, she went to her dad and leaked Osman's plans. Though once again, this part of the story lacks solid evidence to back it up. It might have happened or just be a speculation of contemporary historians. One way or another, it appears that Esad was onto Osman's plans, and he issued a religious decree. He denounced Osman's decisions to go to Mecca and declared that a sultan must not go on pilgrimage. He argued that a sultan had tremendous responsibility to Allah due to his position, and thus Osman must not undertake the Hajj. As we have mentioned in the previous episodes, a decree from the Sheikhul Islam was the highest religious authority in the Ottoman Empire. Osman, in his usual style, neither cared about Esad's decree nor his advisor's advice, and declared that he was more determined than ever. He instead sent letters to the governors of Egypt and Anatolia, ordering them to raise armies. However, to no one but Osman's surprise, news of these orders spread and was heard by everyone in the capital. It turned out that mustering huge armies at times of peace was highly suspicious. By this time, the Janissaries were really fed up. Osman had been waging a political war against them for years now. Thousands of them rose up and gathered in Et Square, protesting against Osman's decision to leave the capital. Once again, Osman did not care. He announced that he was leaving for Hajj even earlier than planned, and ordered his servants to cross to Asia the next morning. This did not bode well with the Janissaries, as expected. A disorganized protest rapidly turned into an organized coup. Janissary commanders convened and visited Esad. They asked Esad the Islamic punishment for those that disobeyed religious orders and caused chaos. Esad replied, "Death." This was more than enough for the Janissaries. With this order, their coup was now legitimate. They took Esad's decree and went back to the Et Square. There, to the thousands of Janissaries, they announced that they demand the heads of 6 ministers within Osman's cabinet. These ministers were Osman's most trusted men who were advocates for his reforms. The same day, a few Janissaries that were protesting outside the Grand Vizier's manor were shot dead by his guards. Upon this, the Janissaries, so far unarmed, stormed the armories and armed themselves. then besieged the palace. This murder also caused the Imperial Navy to join the coup. Several warships blockaded the city and aimed their cannons on the palace. When Osman saw thousands of armed soldiers at his gates and ships on the sea, he finally grasped the delicacy of the situation and announced that he decided not to go on Hajj. But he added he had no intention of executing or dismissing the 6 ministers the Janissaries wanted dead. He did not stop there and doubled down. He announced that all Janissary payments were suspended until further notice. This decision was comically bad, as it gave the Janissaries no option but to fight for their jobs. It appeared that Osman's grasp on situation remained delusional. He imprisoned the group of religious clerics the Janissaries had sent to the palace to negotiate with him. Not only did he imprison the Janissary emissaries, but he also turned to his ministers and threatened to execute them, accusing them of treason, as almost everyone in the court advised Osman to give the Janissaries what they wanted. This did not gain him any friends within his own palace, of course. When the Janissaries realized that the imams they sent to negotiate were not returning, all hell broke loose. Yet they were still too scared to storm the palace. They thought that a huge number of palace guards, all armed and ready, were waiting behind the palace gates to fight them. But soon after, a Janissary climbed to the minaret of Hagia Sophia and saw that no one was inside the courtyard, not a single guard. They quickly realized that Osman had not a friend left inside the palace. The Janissaries stormed the first courtyard, and there they were joined by Osman's ministers, whom he had threatened before. They not only joined the Janissaries, but also advised them that killing Osman's reformist ministers was not going to be enough. They told the Janissaries that Osman was mad and that they should instead crown Osman's uncle, Mustafa, who was dethroned because, well, he was mad. This idea was quickly accepted by the Janissary officers. They proceeded to storm the second courtyard. At first, they could not find Mustafa, but then one of Mustafa's wives called them in and showed his cell. The former Sultan was being held in a solid stone cell with no windows and a fortified gate. Janissaries, despite trying hard, could not get in. At the end, they climbed to the roof of the building, drilled it open, and slid down from the roof with ropes. A couple of women from Mustafa's service tried to stop them, but these women were killed by the Janissaries. Mustafa asked for water from the Janissaries, as he was not given water or food for the last 3 days. He was so weak from harsh treatment that he had no energy to even sit. Janissaries, after seeing how Osman treated his uncle, became even more determined to dethrone him. They then took Mustafa to the audience hall. Right there, the religious clerics and the Janissaries had a falling apart. Assad and the other imams did not want to dethrone Osman. They merely wanted a show of force and a new cabinet, to show Osman his place, if you will. Assad probably had 2 motives here. First of all, he was the father-in-law of the Sultan and would rather not lose this privilege. Other factor was that Mustafa was mad and in no shape to rule. In fact, Assad was the one that dethroned Mustafa previously. But the Janissaries were fed up with Osman and knew that he would come after them if they let him keep the throne. Thus, at the end, Janissaries forced Assad and the other imams to pledge allegiance to Mustafa under the threat of swords. Hearing of this, Osman rushed to the audience hall with his guards. He pleaded to the Janissaries to leave Mustafa to him, promising the Janissaries all they desired. However, the Janissaries refused, then took Mustafa to the old palace, as they had not secured the inner parts of the Imperial palace at this point. The end for Osman was in sight. The Janissaries now had a candidate who not only had their support, but also was legitimized by Assad. Osman was advised by his ministers to take refuge in the Janissary barracks. According to the barrack customs, men that take refuge there will not be harmed. But Osman was not going down easily. He ordered his men to prepare boats. He wanted to get to Anatolia with boats, reach Bursa, and prepare an army to take Constantinople back. Osman lost his last followers there, as this move clearly meant a civil war, and at this point in Ottoman history, there hadn't been a civil war for 100 years. No sane government official would follow Osman to a civil war. His last remaining men left him, and he could not get any boats, as the Janissaries had already seized them and the Imperial Navy was blockading the palace. That night he finally gave up and met with the Janissary commander. They cut a deal behind closed doors. We do not know the details of this deal, for the same night the Janissary commander was murdered by his own officers, who presumably did not like the deal that was agreed upon. The death of the Coups commander destroyed any semblance of organization among the rebels. Janissaries started looting the villas and shops in the city. Meanwhile, a group of Janissaries stormed the palace. By this point, Osman did not have a single guard by him. He was found with his concubines in Harem and was taken to the Janissary barracks. On the way to the barracks, the mob threw stones to Osman and insulted him. At one point, a man came forward and sexually assaulted him by squeezing his testicles. The man was chased away by Janissaries, who pitied Osman afterwards. He was then brought to the Janissary mosque. As all this happened, Sultan Mustafa's mother, who had the real power now, on the account of Mustafa being mentally unstable, had appointed a shadow cabinet. The newly appointed Grand Vizier, Davud Pasha, was waiting there with the Janissary officers. Davud Pasha and Mustafa's mother wanted Osman dead. They knew that Mustafa could not reign long as there was another candidate to sit on the throne. But the Janissaries were fiercely against this. Regicide was a serious crime, and those that commit regicide would not live for long. The Janissaries argued that they would not leave that mosque alive should they commit regicide, that the people gathered in the streets would lynch them right there, and instead proposed to imprison Osman for life. The Grand Vizier tried to make a show of force there. He called in his executioners and set them on Osman, but the Janissary officers had none of it. They beat up both the executioners and the Grand Vizier and kicked them out. At night, Osman was transferred to the infamous Yedikule dungeons, where he was going to spend the rest of his life. Yet Mustafa's mother was not done yet. Grand Vizier, on her orders, visited Yedikule dungeons that night with his executioners. They entered Osman's cell and strangled him to death. At first, Osman resisted the numerous executioners, but at the end, one of them got a hold of his testicles and squeezed them until they bled. Meanwhile, the others strangled Osman with a bowstring. A truly horrifying way to go. Thus ended the reign of Sultan Osman Khan II at the age of 19. Sultan Osman the Young is widely romanticized in Ottoman history. He is seen as the young reformist who was killed by the big bad Janissaries. But after an impartial read, it becomes apparent that he was not only a bad sultan, but also arrogant and delusional. A wise king knows what he knows and what he does not. Osman never did. He never heeded good advice. At the end, childish reactions opened the Pandora's box. Until that point, no sultan was dethroned by the Janissaries, let alone killed. And Osman pushed the Janissaries to their limits. He provoked the Janissaries to the best of his abilities. After Osman, however, Janissaries would get much bolder and start dethroning sultans at whim. The Janissary dictatorship lasted 50 years, from the death of Osman to death of Kösem. Meanwhile, his planned reforms were extremely nonsensical. Sekbans, whom he planned to replace Janissaries with, were unreliable thugs. In the last 50 years, Ottoman Empire was plagued by Sekban revolts, known as the Celali revolts. If he had succeeded, it is likely that the empire would fall long before when it actually fell. It is clear that his reforms were not based on rational ideas, but rather on getting back at his political rivals. And what of the murders of Osman? Grand Vizier Davut Pasha was murdered shortly after, as well as the Janissaries that were involved in the coup after a popular uprising caused by the regicide. The 65th Janissary Regiment that assisted Osman's execution were disbanded and officially cursed. Osman's wife, Akile Sultan, got married with a famous poet and calligrapher, whom she is said to have a happy marriage with. Mustafa himself was dethroned by a palace coup 1.5 years later, kick-starting the reign of Kösem Sultan. Thank you for watching our video on Osman II of the Ottoman Empire. This is the last video on this topic. Please subscribe and leave a like, and we will see you in our next series.